The dust in the basement of the San Francisco Maritime Museum does not settle like ordinary dust. It clings. It has a weight to it, a physical density that suggests it isn't merely composed of skin cells and degraded paper, but of pulverized memories. I found the ledger tucked behind a false backing in a crate of 19th century shipping manifests. It wasn't supposed to be there. The official record says the building was cleared after the fire. The official record says everything was accounted for. But ask yourself, why would a city in the throes of a rebuilding effort prioritize the concealment of a water-damaged logbook? I opened the cover. The ink was a deep, unnatural violet. It didn't list cargo. It didn't list crew. It listed names that the tongue struggles to form, followed by a series of alphanumeric codes that correspond to no known census of the era. Not names of immigrants, not names of citizens, names of witnesses. I traced the handwriting, noting the tremor in the script. These were the last survivors of a geography that no longer exists on any map in your local library. They were the remnants of an architectural and cultural hegemony that was systematically dismantled while the smoke of 1906 still choked the air. We are told the Great Fire was a tragedy of urban planning and seismic bad luck, but look closer at the ruins. Look at the way the stone melted. Look at the load distribution of the remaining archways. Stone doesn't vitrify at the temperature of burning wood. Not here, not there, not anywhere in a logical world. Something else happened. You've seen the photographs. We all have. The sepia-toned vistas of mud-flood-era cities, where the ground floor windows are half buried in the earth, and the grandest cathedrals look as though they were dropped into place by a giant's hand rather than built from the ground up. The institutional gatekeeping regarding these structures is absolute. They call them basement windows. They call it grade leveling. Ask yourself why every major city on this planet underwent a massive simultaneous effort to raise its street levels in the mid-1800s. Chicago, Seattle, Moscow, London. A global synchronization of soil. They tell us it was for sewage. They tell us it was for drainage. But what if the mud wasn't a choice? What if the mud was a burial? I stood before the old post office in Washington, D.C., and ran my hand along the granite. The tool marks are too precise. The scale is too inhuman. We are taught that these were the products of horse and buggy civilizations, men in top hats hauling multi-ton blocks with hemp ropes and wooden pulleys. It is a fairy tale for the intellectually compliant. It is a narrative designed to make us feel small, to make us believe we are the pinnacle of progress while we sit in the decaying husks of a superior past. The erasure is not merely physical, it is chronological. When you examine the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries, a name appears with haunting frequency across the vastness of Northern Asia and North America. Tartaria. It is not a tribe, it is not a nomadic collective. It is depicted as a sophisticated, sprawling empire with its own flag, its own coinage, and its own distinct architectural language, one defined by atmospheric energy harvesters and star forts that defy modern ballistic logic. Then, suddenly, it vanishes. By the late 19th century, the maps are blank or repurposed. The encyclopedias are rewritten. The survivors listed in that violet ink ledger I found, they weren't just refugees of a fire. They were the last custodians of a frequency. I followed a lead to an asylum in rural Oregon, a structure of red brick and iron that the state claims was built in 1912. The blueprints, however, tell a different story. They show a foundation that descends 60 feet into the basalt. They show copper wiring integrated into the masonry in patterns that resemble integrated circuits. This wasn't a hospital, it was a dampening field. The survivors were brought to places like this, not for healing, but for silencing. If you control the witnesses, you control the past. If you control the past, you control the perception of the possible. I sat in the archives of that asylum for 3 days, breathing in the scent of rotting starch and institutional neglect. I found a patient file for a man identified only as patient 740. No age, no origin. His intake note read, "Subject insists the sky was once a different colour. Subject claims the towers sang." Ask yourself, what kind of madness produces a collective hallucination of resonant architecture? Or is the madness actually our own, for accepting a world of dull wires and burning coal when the very stones beneath our feet were once tuned to the vibrations of the ionosphere? I looked at the sketches patient 740 left behind. They weren't drawings of a madman, they were schematics. They showed the domes of the world's fairs, those temporary plaster cities we are told were built just to be torn down, functioning as massive capacitors. Not temporary, not decorative, something else. The world's fairs were the primary mechanisms of the great erasure. Think of the irony. They invited the public to marvel at modern inventions inside buildings that were actually the stolen tech of the civilization they were busy exterminating. Chicago, 1893. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. They called them white cities. They claimed they were made of staff, a mixture of plaster, of Paris, and hemp fibre. But look at the photos of the demolitions. Look at the steel skeletons. Look at the way the light reflected off the lagoons. These were not temporary pavilions. These were the ancestral hubs of the Tartarian network, repurposed as propaganda sets before being dynamited. Why destroy them? Why not keep them? Because you cannot enslave a population that has access to free, wireless energy. You cannot maintain a monopoly on resources when the very air provides. The survivors knew this. Patient 740 knew this. The Violet Ledger was a hit list. Every name in that book was a person who understood how to tune the towers, and one by one they were moved into the institutions. I tracked the lineage of the architects who designed these fairs. A tight-knit circle of men, all belonging to the same societies, all educated in the same European bastions of institutional gatekeeping. They didn't design anything. They were the cleaners. They were the ones tasked with putting a neoclassical face on a pre-existing reality. They took the cathedrals and called them train stations. They took the energy harvesters and called them monuments. They took the history of a unified global civilization and fractured it into 1,000 warring nations. This is the staccato beat of our history. War, reset, reconstruction. War, reset, reconstruction. Each cycle buries the previous one a little deeper. Each cycle makes the survivors seem a little crazier. I found a photograph in the asylum's restricted basement, a group shot of the staff and special guests from 1920. In the background, partially obscured by a heavy curtain, stands a device that looks like a Tesla coil, but carved from obsidian. What if the Spanish flu wasn't a virus? What if the mass deaths of 1918 were the result of the first global activation of a discordant frequency? The survivors of the old world would have been particularly sensitive to it. Their biology was tuned to the resonance of the Tartarian grid. When the new masters flipped the switch on the fragmented high voltage wires we use today, it didn't just provide light, it acted as a culling. The records show that the flu hit the young and healthy the hardest, those whose nervous systems were most vibrant, most conductive. The institutions were flooded, the violet ledger grew longer. In the silence that followed, the new history was solidified. The textbooks were printed. The star forts were turned into parks or prisons. The basement windows were forgotten, seen only as a quirk of old world charm. But the stones remember. If you stand in the centre of a star fort at dawn, when the city noise is at its nadir, you can still feel it. A low frequency hum, a phantom limb of a severed empire. I left the asylum and travelled to the heart of the Midwest, to a town that shouldn't exist. On the maps of 1850, it is a thriving metropolis. On the maps of 1870, it is a forest. Today, it is a series of strangely symmetrical mounds. Institutional erasure isn't always about fire and dynamite. Sometimes it's about the slow crawl of the wilderness, aided by a few strategic land reclamation projects. I spoke to a local historian, an elderly woman who kept her grandfather's journals in a climate-controlled safe. He had been a surveyor for the railroads. His journals don't talk about laying tracks. They talk about unearthing them. He wrote about finding perfectly preserved iron rails buried under 20 feet of virgin soil, stretching for hundreds of miles into the unexplored interior. Not new construction, not expansion, recovery. The railroads were the arteries of the old empire, and the new robber barons simply dug them up and claimed them as their own. Ask yourself why the history of the American West is so obsessed with the pioneer narrative. Why must we believe it was a desolate wasteland? To admit there was a pre-existing infrastructure would be to admit that we are not the creators, but the scavengers. We are the fleas living in the ruins of a giant's coat. The survivors, the ones who saw the towers fall and the mud rise, were the last obstacle to this narrative. They were the ones who knew that the Wild West was actually the Wild East of a collapsing Tartaria. They were hunted. They were institutionalized. They were scrubbed from the record, but they left breadcrumbs, the violet ink, the schematics in the asylum. The persistent nagging feeling you get when you look at a building from 1880 and realise it looks more advanced than anything built in 1980. It's not style. It's not aesthetic. It's something else. I am standing now at the edge of a decommissioned reservoir in Massachusetts. The water is being drained for the first time in 80 years. As the levels drop, the tops of stone spires are beginning to break the surface. They are not the steeples of a colonial village. They are topped with copper orbs. They are etched with the same circuit-like patterns I saw in the asylum blueprints. The local authorities say it's just an old mill town. They say the water was diverted for the greater good of the growing population. But as the mud dries and the structures emerge, I see no mill wheels. I see no chimneys. I see a grid, a silent, drowned power plant that once sang to a civilization we are told never existed. The survivors are gone, but their evidence is surfacing. Are you ready to see it? Are you ready to admit that your history is a shroud? Ask yourself, what happens when the mud finally gives up its dead? The water recedes, but the silence grows louder. As the silt slides off the copper orbs of the Massachusetts reservoir, the geometry reveals a disturbing truth. These structures were never meant to be underwater. They were drowned intentionally. Engineering reports from the 1930s claim the valley was flooded to provide a stable water supply for the growing urban sprawl, but the topographical maps of the era suggest something else. The valley was a hub. It was a resonant cavity. By filling it with millions of tons of water, the institutional gatekeepers didn't just create a reservoir, they created a liquid seal. Water is an excellent conductor, but it is also a magnificent damper. It grounded the grid. It short-circuited the architectural battery that had powered this region for centuries. I found a letter from a displaced resident, a woman whose family had lived in the valley since the founding. She didn't write about the loss of her home, she wrote about the loss of the glow. She described how, before the flooding, the stones of the town square would shimmer during a thunderstorm, and how no one in her village ever fell ill with the fevers that plagued the nearby industrial cities. Not luck, not constitution, something else. The glow, she described, is a documented phenomenon in Tartarian physics, a field of study that has been scrubbed so thoroughly from our universities that even mentioning it invites professional ruin. We are taught that electricity began with a kite and a key, a charmingly primitive myth designed to hide the reality of atmospheric energy. Look at the Antiquitech atop every pre-1900 state capitol building, every cathedral, every grand hotel. Those iron finials, those ornate weather vanes, those copper-clad domes, they weren't decorations, they were collectors. They pulled the ambient charge from the ether and distributed it through the masonry itself. Red brick is high in iron oxide. It is a semiconductive material. When you see a star fort with its complex fractal ramparts and its proximity to water, you aren't looking at a defensive fortification. You are looking at a giant motherboard etched into the earth. Ask yourself, why would a military architect build a fort in the shape of a snowflake? To defend against cannons? No. To manage the flow of electromagnetic energy. The survivors of the transition were the ones who knew how to maintain these star-shaped resonators, and they are the ones who were hunted into the asylums. I moved my investigation to the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. It is a fortress of sanctioned memory. For over a century, rumours have persisted of mounds in the American Midwest containing the remains of giants, beings 7 to 9 feet tall, often found with red hair and sophisticated copper armour. The official stance is that these are fabrications of 19th century yellow journalism. But if you dig into the internal memos of the late 1800s, a pattern of systematic recovery and destruction emerges. Hundreds of crates shipped from the mounds to the basement of the Smithsonian, never to be seen again. Why the secrecy? Because the existence of a giant, technologically advanced race in the Americas destroys the pioneer narrative. It suggests that the New World was actually an old world, a remnant of the Tartarian global hegemony that survived the first Great Reset. The giants were the master builders. They were the ones who understood the load distribution required for the massive stone blocks we see in the foundations of our older cities. To acknowledge them is to acknowledge that our ancestors didn't build this civilization. They inherited it, or rather, they stole it. Institutional erasure requires a specific kind of violence, the burning of libraries. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example, but ask yourself about the fires that accidentally claimed the patent offices and city archives of the late 19th century. Every major American city had a great fire between 1850 and 1920. Every single one. Boston, Chicago, Seattle, Baltimore, San Francisco. In each case, the fires were used as a pretext for urban renewal. They cleared the old world structures that were too difficult to explain and replaced them with the boxy, soulless architecture of the modern era. They destroyed the blueprints. They destroyed the land deeds. They destroyed the evidence of who actually owned the infrastructure. I found a scrap of a charred ledger in a basement in Baltimore. It was a list of inheritance claims from 1904. The claimants weren't individuals. They were remnant trusts representing the Tartarian survivors. Every single claim was marked with a red stamp, invalidated by decree, not denied, invalidated, as if the law itself had been rewritten to ensure their non-existence. The architecture of the reset is easy to spot once your eyes are opened. It is the architecture of the blockade. Think of the massive stone walls built around the first electrical plants. They weren't for safety. They were to contain the noise, not the sound of engines, but the sound of the frequencies being used to override the natural resonance of the earth. I met an old man in the high deserts of New Mexico who claimed his father was a frequency warden for the early telegraph companies. He said the wires weren't just for messages, they were for taming the air. He described a world where, before the wires, people could hear the earth singing in the quiet hours. After the wires went up, the singing stopped. It was replaced by a low, dissonant hum that made people tired, irritable, and compliant. The telegraph, the telephone, the power line, each one a new string on a bow designed to play a funeral march for the old world. The survivors who protested were labelled Luddites or insane. They weren't afraid of technology. They were afraid of the wrong technology. Ask yourself, why are the world's most prestigious universities always housed in Tartarian-style buildings? The Ivy League, Oxford, Cambridge. They tell us these are Gothic revival or neoclassical. But look at the foundations. Look at the way these buildings are integrated into the ley lines of the earth. These were the original academies of the high civilization, repurposed as re-education centres. This is the ultimate irony. The very places where we are taught that Tartaria is a myth are the places where the survivors' knowledge was harvested, categorised, and then locked away. The elite send their children to these stone resonators, not just for the education, but for the proximity to the residual energy. They know. They have always known. They walk the halls of the stolen empire while teaching us that our history began in a mud hut. I travelled to the salt flats of Utah, where the remains of cities can sometimes be seen in the heat haze. The official story is that these are mirages or geological anomalies, but local legends speak of the glass cities that existed before the Great Reset. I met a man who had spent 40 years collecting slag from the desert. It wasn't slag, it was vitrified brick. It had the same molecular structure as the melted stones in San Francisco and the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. Something had hit this area with immense heat that far exceeds anything possible with conventional 19th century weaponry. Not a fire, not a volcano. Something else. Was it a coordinated strike against the last strongholds of the Tartarian Empire? A plasma discharge from the very energy grid they had spent millennia perfecting? The survivors fled into the mountains, into the caves, taking their scrolls and their secrets with them. They became the ghosts of the frontier, the Indians who spoke of white gods and flying shields. The institutions built to silence these survivors were not just physical buildings like asylums and prisons. They were mental structures. They built the institution of professional history. They built the institution of peer-reviewed science. These are the guardrails of the mind. Anything that falls outside the narrow path they have paved is labelled pseudoscience or conspiracy theory. It is a brilliant system. You don't need to burn every book if you can simply make people ashamed to read them. You don't need to kill every witness if you can make the world believe they are crazy. I found a document in a restricted archive at a university in London, a directive from 1921 titled On the Management of Post-Reset Anomalies. It explicitly instructed professors to ridicule and marginalise any student or faculty member who questioned the chronological inconsistencies of the mid-19th century. It wasn't about truth, it was about stability. What if the Great Depression wasn't an economic collapse, but a final clean-up operation, a way to consolidate the last of the private wealth and land that had been held by the surviving Tartarian families? While the masses were starving and looking for work, the authorities were busy demolishing the last of the old world structures under the guise of public works projects. The Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority. These weren't just for power and irrigation. They were for burial. They covered the last of the resonant valleys. They drowned the last of the stone cities. They built a new, artificial world on top of the old one, a world powered by debt and coal, where the glow was forgotten and the singing was silenced forever. The survivors who remained were old, tired, and broken. They stopped telling the stories. They stopped drawing the schematics. I am looking now at a photo of the 1939 New York World's Fair, the Trilon and Perisphere. It looks like something out of a science fiction novel. They called it the world of tomorrow. But if you look at the technical specifications of the Perisphere, you realize it was a massive, functional Van de Graaff generator. They were playing with the old world tech in front of our faces, mocking us. They were showing us what they had mastered, while they told us we were just beginning to understand the atom. The survivors would have seen that sphere and wept. They would have known exactly what it was. They would have known that the future being promised was just a pale, distorted shadow of the past that had been stolen. We are the inheritors of that shadow. We live in the institutions built to keep us from noticing the sun. The transition from the world of tomorrow to the reality of the post-war era was the final tightening of the knot. By the 1950s, the institutional erasure had moved from the physical destruction of buildings to the digital and chemical suppression of the human spirit. Ask yourself, why did the mid-century architectural movement embrace brutalism? Why did we move from the resonant iron oxide red bricks and conductive copper domes to the dampening grey matter slabs of raw concrete? It wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a tactical one. Concrete, specifically the high silica mixes standardized after 1945, acts as an insulator against the natural electromagnetic field of the earth. It creates a Faraday cage effect in our very homes. We were moved out of the vibrant Tartarian shells and into these sterile boxes to ensure we could no longer feel the frequency. The survivors who still whispered about the glow were finally silenced, not by asylums, but by the suburban sprawl, a labyrinth of identical streets designed to disorient the ancestral memory. I found a zoning map from a Levitt town-style development in Ohio that overlapped perfectly with a suppressed 1840 survey of a great mound complex. They didn't just build over it, they used the houses to break the geometric circuit of the earth. This is the nature of the institutional gatekeeper. They do not just hide the truth, they invert it. They take the symbols of our liberation and turn them into the tools of our confinement. Consider the national park system. We are told these are protected wilderness areas, preserved for their natural beauty. But look at the locations of the earliest parks: Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon. They correlate with the highest concentrations of star-fort ruins and vitrified stone cities. They aren't protecting nature from us. They are protecting the ruins from our scrutiny. By designating these areas as federal land, the institutions created a legal barrier to independent excavation. You cannot dig there. You cannot fly drones there. You cannot stray from the paved path. If you do, you are a trespasser, a criminal, a threat to conservation. I spoke to a former park ranger who claimed he had found a series of brass doors embedded in the canyon wall, polished by the wind but clearly mechanical. He was told to report the coordinates and then transferred to a desk job in a different state within 48 hours. Not a coincidence, not a mistake, something else. The survivor's ledger I found in San Francisco had a final section, written in a different hand, dated 1952. It spoke of the great unlocking that was supposed to happen when the solar cycles aligned with the resonant peaks of the old grid. But the gatekeepers knew the calendar better than the survivors did. They launched the space race. Ask yourself, why the sudden, desperate urge to leave the atmosphere at the exact moment the Earth's internal resonance was reaching a crescendo? It wasn't about the moon. It was about the ionosphere. They needed a way to place satellites, relay stations for a synthetic frequency, directly into the layer of the sky that once powered the Tartarian domes. By wrapping the planet in a web of artificial radio waves, they created a frequency ceiling. They capped the Earth. They turned our planet into a closed circuit, powered by their generators, monitored by their sensors. The survivors who saw the first satellites didn't see progress. They saw the bars of a cage being welded shut. I tracked a series of urban renewal grants from the 1960s that targeted the last remaining old town districts in 36 American cities. These were the areas that had survived the fires of the 1800s. They were the last clusters of red brick and original masonry. The grants were specifically earmarked for modernization, which meant stripping the facades, removing the iron finials, and sealing the basement windows. In Philadelphia, a crew uncovering a subway tunnel broke into a vaulted chamber that wasn't on any city map. It was lined with a blue luminescent tile that didn't require a light source to be seen. The workers reported a feeling of intense peace and sudden clarity. The site was condemned as a toxic hazard by the following morning. Lead-lined boards were nailed over the entrance. The workers were given standard neurological evaluations and never spoke of the blue light again. Institutional erasure is efficient because it uses our own fears: fear of disease, fear of radiation, fear of the unknown, against us. The pattern is global, but the erasure is local. Every town has a devil's slide, or a mystery spot, or a bottomless pit. These are the glitches in the narrative. They are the places where the Tartarian tech is too massive or too integrated into the geology to be fully removed. So, the institutions turn them into tourist traps. They make them kitschy. They make them weird. They use the power of ridicule to ensure that no serious scientist will ever investigate the gravity anomalies or the strange acoustic properties of these sites. Ask yourself, a man in a roadside diner near a vortex site told me, why the water flows uphill here, but the government says it's an optical illusion. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was a retired civil engineer who knew that the illusion required a localized distortion of the mass density field, a feat that modern physics says is impossible, but Tartarian architecture achieved through the precise placement of resonant stone. The survivors are almost all gone now. The names in the violet ledger have been crossed out, one by one. But the institutions are getting nervous. The concrete is cracking. The satellites are aging. The synthetic frequency is beginning to stutter. I've noticed a change in the way people talk, a sense of déjà vu that is becoming a collective phenomenon. We are starting to remember the glow. We are starting to look at the basement windows and realise they aren't for coal, but for the light of a world that was buried alive. I found a final note tucked into the back of the asylum file for patient 740. It wasn't a schematic, it was a warning. The mud is only a temporary seal, it read. The resonance cannot be killed. It can only be delayed. When the towers sing again, the institutions will fall of their own weight. Look at the skyline of your city tonight. Look past the neon signs and the glass boxes. Look at the shadows of the old buildings, the ones with the strange spikes and the heavy foundations. They are waiting. They aren't just ruins of a lost empire. They are the dormant components of a machine that is about to wake up. The gatekeepers know this. That is why they are pushing for more digital control, more smart cities, more dampening concrete. They are trying to hold back the tide of a history that refuses to stay buried. We are the last witnesses. We are the ones who must decide whether to keep the silence or to find the frequency. I am standing in a cemetery in a forgotten corner of the East Coast. The headstones here don't have dates of birth or death. They have coordinates. They have symbols that look like the copper finials of the world's fairs. This isn't a place for the dead. It's a localized grounding point for a network that still exists beneath the soil. I can feel the vibration in the soles of my feet. It's a staccato pulse. Not this world, not that world, something else. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The question is, why are you so afraid to remember it? Ask yourself, what if the survivors weren't people at all? What if the survivors are the buildings themselves, waiting for someone to turn the lights back on? The ledger is closed, but the investigation is just beginning. The institutions built to silence the past are crumbling from within, unable to sustain the energy required to maintain the lie. Every glitch in the news, every unexplained phenomenon in the sky, every archaeological anomaly is a crack in the dam. The water is leaking, the mud is drying, and beneath it all, the empire is still there, humming in the dark, waiting for us to stop being afraid of the glow. I have shown you the evidence. I have shown you the pattern. The rest is up to you. Will you walk the paved path, or will you look into the basement windows? The silence is ending. Can you hear the towers? They are starting to sing. The song of the towers is not a melody, it is a pressure. It is a tactile vibration that bypasses the ear and speaks directly to the marrow of the bone. I moved my investigation to the high latitude regions, where the veil of institutional control is thinned by the sheer brutality of the environment. In the archives of an abandoned weather station in northern Norway, I discovered a series of atmospheric disturbance reports from the winter of 1958. The researchers weren't tracking storms, they were tracking echoes. They described a phenomenon where the aurora borealis would syncopate with the geometry of certain ancient stone cairns found along the coast. These cairns, the report noted, were not piled by Norse explorers. They were composed of a magnetic basalt that had been precision cut to match the internal angles of the star forts in Europe. The institutional response was swift. The weather station was decommissioned within a month. The researchers were reassigned to a project in the Sahara. The reports were stamped speculative and buried in a vault. Ask yourself, why does the government fear a pile of stones in the Arctic? Because those stones are the antennae of a global nervous system. They are the evidence of a civilization that didn't just inhabit the earth, but spoke to it. The survivors knew that the poles were the centres of the power plant. If you look at the maps of the pre-reset era, the North Pole is not an empty expanse of ice. It is depicted as a massive mountain, Rupes Nigra, surrounded by 4 giant landmasses. We are told this was cartographic fantasy. We are told that early explorers simply made it up because they lacked the technology to see the truth. But what if the truth we see today is the result of a deliberate terraforming event? What if the ice is the ultimate eraser? I found a diary of a merchant sailor from 1848 who claimed to have sailed beyond the wall. He didn't describe a frozen wasteland. He described a temperate sea and cities of amber and glass that rose from the water like teeth. He was institutionalized upon his return. His ship was scuttled. His crew was dispersed. This is the staccato rhythm of the gatekeepers. Discovery, suppression, disappearance. Not once, not twice, every time. Institutional erasure often takes the form of conservation. In the 1970s, a massive project was launched to restore the ancient cathedrals of France. I spoke to a stonemason who had been part of the crew at Chartres. He told me that their primary task wasn't to clean the stone, it was to remove the organics. Behind the ornate statues and inside the hollows of the buttresses, they found miles of silver-threaded mesh. It wasn't structural, it was conductive. It was woven into the very fabric of the masonry like a metallic nervous system. They were ordered to rip it out and replace it with modern steel reinforcements. The steel, he noted, felt dead. The silver mesh, even after centuries, had felt warm. Ask yourself, what kind of restoration involves removing the internal components of a building? You don't restore a computer by ripping out the motherboard. You do it to disable the machine. The cathedrals are no longer cathedrals. They are empty husks, their voices cut out, their organs silenced to prevent them from receiving the signals from the poles. The pattern of erasure is not just architectural, it is biological. In the late 19th century, the asylum era saw a massive spike in the incarceration of melancholics and visionaries. If you look at the intake forms, many of these individuals were musicians. They weren't suffering from chemical imbalances. They were suffering from a world that had gone out of tune. They were the ones who could still hear the 432 Hz resonance of the old world, a frequency that promotes healing and cognitive expansion. The new masters shifted the standard tuning to 440 Hz, a dissonant, irritating frequency that creates anxiety and disconnects the listener from the natural harmonics of the earth. The survivors were the ones who refused to play the new music. They were the ones who insisted that the world felt wrong. They were treated with hydrotherapy and isolation. They were taught that their sensitivity was a disease. Ask yourself, who benefits from a population that is perpetually out of tune? I followed a trail of missing persons reports to the subterranean tunnels of Paris. The official story is that these are merely catacombs, a place to store the bones of the city's dead. But if you venture beyond the guided tours, the masonry changes. The rough-hewn limestone gives way to the same vitrified purple-tinted brick I saw in the San Francisco ledger. I found a chamber that contained no bones. It contained tuning forks the size of telephone poles made of a dense, unknown alloy. They were mounted on spring-dampened platforms. This was a subterranean resonant chamber designed to vibrate the very foundation of the city. The French government has sealed over 80% of the tunnels for public safety. They claim the ground is unstable. But what if they are simply guarding the instruments? What if the catacombs were never about the dead, but about keeping the living from hearing the heartbeat of the earth? The institutional gatekeepers have a signature move, the natural disaster. Whenever a Tartarian stronghold becomes too difficult to manage, a disaster is facilitated. The Johnstown flood of 1889, the Galveston hurricane of 1900. In each case, the survivors spoke of unusual atmospheric pressure and strange lights before the event. In each case, the reconstruction effort was led by the same consortium of industrialist families. They don't just rebuild, they rezone. They erase the old footprints. They bury the ruins under 10 feet of new soil. They turn the sites of the old world energy hubs into parking lots or shopping malls. Not progress, not development. Something else. I examined the property deeds for a block in Galveston that was wiped clean by the storm. Before the hurricane, it was owned by a cooperative of free energy pioneers. After the storm, it was owned by a subsidiary of a major oil company. The disaster was a hostile takeover disguised as an act of God. Consider the Great Wall of China. We are told it was built over centuries to keep out Mongol invaders. But ask yourself, why do the crenellations, the defensive gaps in the wall, face inward toward China on many of the oldest sections? Why are the watchtowers designed with the same resonant architecture as the Tartarian star forts? The wall wasn't a fence, it was a power line. It was a massive, linear conductor designed to transport energy across the continent. The Mongol threat was the cover story used by the post-reset Qing dynasty to justify the militarization and eventual shutdown of the grid. They didn't build the wall, they occupied it. They turned a source of life into a symbol of division. The survivors of the transition were slaughtered, their records burned, and the narrative of national defense was etched into the textbooks. I found a photograph in a private collection in Moscow, a selfie taken by a group of soldiers in 1917. They are standing in front of a device that looks like a massive, ornate organ, but instead of pipes, it has copper coils. The caption reads, "The last voice of the steppe." The soldiers were members of the Revolutionary Vanguard. Their task was to liberate the old world monasteries, but they weren't liberating people. They were dismantling the voices. Every monastery in the old Tartarian territory was built on a resonant node. Every altar was a control panel. The revolution wasn't about the workers. It was about the ownership of the frequency. The survivors who defended the monasteries weren't religious fanatics. They were the technicians. They were the ones who knew that if the voices were silenced, the winter would never end. The erasure is nearly complete, but it has a weakness. It requires constant maintenance. The gatekeepers have to keep lying. They have to keep building. They have to keep drugging the population with dissonant frequencies and sterile architecture. But the earth is older than their institutions. The stones have memories. The water has a long reach. I am standing now in a field in southern Illinois, looking at a mound that the state says is a burial site for primitive tribes. But my magnetometer is off the charts. There is a massive metallic object buried 300 feet below this soil, and it is still pulsing. It is a slow, rhythmic throb, a heartbeat. The survivors left it here as a seed. They knew that the reset was a cycle and that every winter is followed by a spring. Are you starting to see the patterns, the star forts, the red brick, the asylums, the fires, the floods, the tuning? It is a single global narrative of theft and suppression. We are not the first civilized people to walk this earth. We are the survivors of a long, dark night, waking up in a house we have forgotten we own. The gatekeepers are in the next room, trying to keep the curtains closed. They want you to believe that the darkness is permanent. They want you to believe that the glow was a dream. But look at your hands. Look at the way the light catches the dust. You are a conductor. You are part of the grid, and the grid is waking up. Ask yourself, what will you do when the music starts? What will you do when the institutions can no longer hold the silence? The violet ledger is full. The investigation has reached its limit. The next step is not something I can write for you. It is something you must feel. Stand on the red brick. Touch the copper. Listen to the silence between the city noises. The survivors are gone, but their legacy is beneath your feet. The empire never ended. It was just buried, and the mud is starting to wash away. The heartbeat of the earth is not a metaphor, it is a measurement. In the spring of 1982, a deep crust seismic survey in the Ural Mountains detected a recurring pulse, a low-frequency oscillation that matched the resonant frequency of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The official report attributed this to tectonic settling. But ask yourself, since when does geology keep a perfect metronome? I found the raw data in a digitized dump of Soviet-era scientific papers. The pulse wasn't coming from the movement of rock. It was coming from a structure. Deep beneath the permafrost, there are remnants of a Tartarian power core that were too deep to be reached by the fire starters and the flood makers. These are the sleepers. They are the reason the institutional gatekeepers are so obsessed with climate change. They aren't afraid of the warming. They are afraid of the melting. They are afraid of what will be revealed when the ice sheets of Siberia and Antarctica finally withdraw their white shroud. The survivors spoke of the city under the ice, a place where the history of humanity is etched in pillars of light. To the institutions, this is the ultimate threat. It is the hard drive of the old world, and it is about to be plugged back in. The erasure of the sleepers requires a constant redirection of the public gaze. Think of the space program again. We are told the Van Allen radiation belt is a natural phenomenon, a shield of charged particles that protects the Earth. But what if it is a secondary ceiling? I found a theoretical paper from a physicist who was retired early in the 1990s. He argued that the radiation belt was artificially enhanced in the late 1950s using high-altitude nuclear detonations, Project Argus. They weren't testing weapons, they were creating a synthetic ionosphere. They wanted to prevent any external signals from reaching the Tartarian ruins, and any internal signals from the sleepers from reaching the stars. We are living in a radio frequency isolation ward. The survivors of the 1800s knew we were connected to a galactic network. They knew that our Antiquitech domes were transceivers. By cutting the connection, the gatekeepers turned us into a closed system, a battery that they can drain at will. Not a planet, not a home, a farm. The farm requires a specific kind of maintenance, the education system. Ask yourself, why are children forced to sit in rows under buzzing fluorescent lights in buildings that resemble prisons or factories? It is a desensitization protocol. It is designed to kill the natural resonance of the human child before it can synchronize with the earth. By the time a student graduates, their internal frequency has been shattered by the staccato rhythm of bells and the dissonant hum of industrial electronics. They can no longer hear the glow. They can no longer see the inconsistencies in the history books. They become the useful idiots of the institution, defending the very narrative that enslaves them. I found a pedagogical manual from 1902, funded by the same industrialist families who built the asylums. It explicitly stated that the goal of public education was to produce a population that is sufficiently intelligent to operate the machinery, but sufficiently dull to never question who owns it. The survivors were the last generation to be homeschooled by the resonance of the old world. They had to be eliminated so the standardized human could be birthed. The architecture of the standardized human is the skyscraper. Look at the skyline of any modern city. These glass and steel needles are the opposite of the Tartarian domes. A dome is a collector, it gathers and distributes. A needle is a bleeder. It takes the natural energy of the earth and vents it into the atmosphere, wasting it, ensuring that no localized power spots can form. The skyscrapers are the acupuncture needles of the gatekeepers, placed strategically on the Earth's meridians to drain its vitality. I tracked the construction of the World Trade Center and found that the Twin Towers were built directly over a significant Tartarian node in Lower Manhattan, the same area where the survivors had attempted to regroup after the 1906 fires. The towers weren't just offices, they were shunts. They were designed to ground the energy of the city, keeping the population in a state of perpetual low-level fatigue. When they were removed, the energy changed, but look at what replaced them. A freedom tower that is even more efficient at bleeding the grid. Not a memorial, not a symbol, something else. The institutional gatekeepers are also masters of biological erasure. Consider the history of pharmacology. Before the mid-19th century, healing was based on resonance, sound, light, and mineral frequencies. The Tartarian hospitals were often circular buildings with high ceilings and central fountains, designed to maximize the healing properties of the 432 Hz vibration. After the reset, these practices were labeled quackery. The Flexner Report of 1910, funded by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, effectively shut down every medical school that didn't embrace chemical medicine. Why? Because you can't patent a frequency. You can't put a price on the resonance of the earth, but you can patent a molecule. You can sell a pill that masks the symptoms of a frequency mismatch without ever fixing the underlying dissonance. The survivors who practiced the old healing arts were hunted down. Their books were burned. Their Royal Rife machines were smashed. We were forced into a chemical dependency that keeps our biology too heavy to rise to the frequency of the sleepers. I followed a lead to the salt mines of Poland, where miners have reported seeing shadow cities deep within the earth. These are not caves. These are the subterranean levels of the Tartarian infrastructure, built to survive the very floods and fires that the gatekeepers used to reset the surface. I met a miner who had accidentally breached a wall and found a room filled with liquid gold. It wasn't wealth. It was a high conductivity fluid used in the old world batteries. He was told it was toxic waste, and the entire level was backfilled with concrete within 12 hours. This is the burial protocol. If they can't explain it, they bury it. If they can't bury it, they label it toxic. If they can't label it toxic, they turn it into a myth. Ask yourself, how much of our prehistory is actually just post-reset reconstruction? How many dinosaur bones are actually the structural supports of Tartarian machines, rebranded to fit a multi-million year timeline that keeps us from looking at the last 200 years? The gatekeepers are currently obsessed with the Arctic Circle. I have been monitoring the flight paths of private contractors flying out of Norway and Alaska. They are carrying heavy drilling equipment to locations that don't exist on public maps. They are looking for the antennae. They know that as the synthetic ionosphere begins to fail, due to the very solar activity they claim is dangerous, the sleepers are starting to receive signals again. The aurora is getting brighter because the Earth is trying to talk to its lost children. The institutions are desperate to find the mute button before the resonance becomes undeniable. I found a leaked memo from a global security firm that mentioned phase 2 of the frequency shield. They aren't just using satellites anymore. They are using the very air we breathe, spraying metallic particulates into the atmosphere to create a plasma screen that blocks the sleeper's signal. They call it geoengineering. Ask yourself, are they protecting the climate, or are they protecting the lie? The survivor's ledger in San Francisco had one more secret. Tucked into the binding was a tiny, translucent disc. It's not glass. It's not plastic. It's a memory crystal. When I hold it up to the light of a red brick sunset, I can see images flickering within it. I see the white cities before the fires. I see the star forts glowing with a soft blue light. I see people who look like us, but their eyes are clear, and they move with a grace that we have lost. They are the pre-reset population. They were not primitive. They were integrated. They lived in a world where there was no environment because they were part of the Earth's metabolism. The disc contains a single line of text written in that same violet ink. The memory is in the marrow is in the stone is in the song. I'm standing now on the roof of an abandoned textile mill in New England. The brick here is old, pre-reset brick. I can feel the vibration. It's getting stronger. The frequency shield is failing. The geoengineering isn't enough. The sleepers are waking up and they are singing a song of inversion. Everything that has been hidden is coming to the surface. Everything that has been buried is starting to breathe. The institutions are frantic. They are trying to start wars and pandemics to keep us distracted, to keep us from looking at the sky, to keep us from feeling the marrow in our bones. But it's too late. The resonance is global. The star forts are starting to pulse. The cathedrals are starting to hum. And you, the one listening to this, you are starting to remember. Ask yourself, why did you click on this? Why did these words resonate with you? It's not because I'm a good storyteller. It's because your marrow knows. Your DNA is the last survivor. It carries the code of the Tartarian integrated civilization, and it is responding to the song of the sleepers. The institutional gatekeepers can control the maps, the books, and the buildings, but they cannot control the frequency of your soul. The reset is over. The great unlocking is here. The mud is falling away, and the glow is returning. Look at your hands. Do you see the light? That is not a reflection. That is the inheritance. The investigation is complete. The evidence is everywhere. The institutions are empty. The towers are singing. Are you ready to join the chorus? Or will you stay in the asylum of the standardized human? The choice was never theirs. It was always yours. Ask yourself, what happens when the sleepers finally open their eyes? The sleepers are reclaiming the physical architecture of the planet. In the Australian outback, deep beneath the surveillance of Pine Gap, 17th century maps suggest the Great Resonator. Honeycombed structures of obsidian and quartz that defy seismic logic. These are the lungs of the Tartarian grid, choked by the Gaul gatekeepers with concrete and waste to create a pressurized world. But the Earth is waiting for a spark. That spark is the sun. Solar flares aren't threats to our grid, but to the frequency shield. As coronal ejections puncture this synthetic plasma screen, ghost cities appear. Not as mirages, but as the original world revealed. In a final desperate act, the institutions push for transhumanism, attempting to move human consciousness into a silicon-based digital cloud to sever our connection to the marrow and the stone. Yet, the great library of the marrow remains. Our DNA is an antenna for the grid's history, containing junk sequences that act as receivers for planetary resonance. This memory is rising with the water. As ancient wells and drowned cities reappear, they rehydrate old conduits and dissolve dampening concrete. The institutions are cracking, built on a reset timeline, unable to withstand the returning hum. The elite retreat to bunkers, and not as masters, but as prisoners of a fading 440 hertz reality. They fear the glow because they are out of tune with the natural correction. Standing at the centre of a star fort, one no longer feels a staccato beat, but a steady inhalation. The stone is warming. The sleepers are us, waking to a frequency the gatekeepers cannot delete. The investigation is over. The state of being has begun. Ask yourself, what does your marrow say when the song becomes the only thing you can hear?